first snow didn't wait for November. It came slicing sideways through the pines, driven by a wind that didn't care where lived or died. Most folks around Berklaw Ridge had spent the weeks before stacking firewood, sealing cabins, patching roofs, burying food beneath frost lines. But up in the clearing behind the old ridgeline trail, where even the Apaches seldom wandered in winter, a woman was climbing a pine tree. She wasn't hiding, and she wasn't fleeing either, though some said she'd gone mad with grief. Others knew her name well enough not to speak it lightly. Mary Tolliver, widow, 33, 2 children, Tommy and Clara, 8 and 4. Her husband had died the spring prior under a rock slide, while trying to free a trapped mule up past Deadmule, leaving behind nothing but a busted wheelbarrow and an old brass locket she now wore like armor. The first time someone spotted her hammering planks up a tree, the news spread like fire on dry thatch. "She's building Anist," Old Man Creed chuckled over his whiskey glass, like a crow. "Maybe she plans on flying away from the cold." Laughter followed, especially from men who had barns full of hay, wives still breathing, and sons to help them to Gwynta's cellars. But Mary never answered to jokes. She just kept climbing day by day, plank by plank. Not some flimsy perch either, but a real structure bracketed into the trunks of 3 tightly grouped pines, lashed with relied, supported with scavenged cross, beams and iron nails, begged or traded from old supply runners. No one helped, nobody offered, not until it got cold. The snows came harder than usual. A storm in early November blanketed the ground a foot deep, and a second one followed, like it was chasing blood. Pitched winds tore roofs and rattled. Chimneys choked. One man's barn caught fire. By the second week, children in town were coughing. Frostbite rumors crept up from the mining camps. And then came something stranger. A trapper passing through Sadehead spotted smoke curling up from the high pines. Not once, but twice. Steady, clean smoke, not wildfire. And through his spyglass, he'd seen light, warm, golden light. He swore by the fur on his back that he'd seen a figure step out onto a platform near the top of the trees, steam rising like morning breath in the freezing air, while every other homestead below had shuttered its windows tight in desperation. No one wanted to believe it, but more than one settler had noticed something odd. Mary wasn't coming down, and her children weren't crying. They were still alive up there in the trees, in that mad wooden contraption everyone had mocked just weeks. Cliff, some folks even remembered scoffing aloud, saying she'd doomed herself and the kids. Said the trees were for birds and cabins were for people. But by now, after one brutal storm and 2 more on the horizon, those same folks had frost creeping through their rafters and no answers from the weather-worn sky. What Mary had built, no one yet fully understood. But it wasn't just a treehouse. It was a system, something clever, hidden, and terribly persistent. And when Mrs. Hanley's boy wandered out one night to chase after a stray goat and nearly froze to death just 200 YD from home, the latter said, "Something peculiar." "I heard laughter," the boy whispered, wrapped in 3 quilts and shaking with fever. High up like kids. They weren't cold. People didn't laugh during these storms, except apparently Mary's children. Thecal didn't just chill the skin, it twisted folks' nerves. Theories grew. Some said she'd found a way to burn Pinnipitch without smoke. Others guessed she'd strung her shelter with animal pelts so thick it trapped every Brit-off warmth. One man, a half-drunk fur trader named Bodie, claimed she was using some old Comanche trick. He'd seen tree platforms used in summer camps, but never like this. She must be feeding heat up from underneath. A fire below, a chamber up high, smoke filtered through snow layers. Hell, maybe she's boiling rocks. A few men tried climbing Therridge Trail to spy for themselves, but halfway up, a snap blizzard howled over the ridge and buried them in drifts too deep to cross. They came back, red-faced and shaken, muttering that it was suicide to go any further. One of them, Cole Draper, who'd once thrown a broken chair at Mary in a general store dispute, returned with frostbitten fingers and a wordless stare. He didn't joke about her anymore. The nights grew longer. Cabin stoves struggled. Babyisware kept pressed to mothers' bodies in root cellars where smoke couldn't reach. Desperation replaced pride, and in town, people started whispering what had once been mockery, but now twisted itself into envy, then fear. What did she know that they didn't? They remembered how she'd gone quiet after her husband's death, how she'd wandered the force alone, even while the children were still in mourning. They recalled how she'd visited the old Apache trader New Rock and come back with a bundle of animal bones and a pot with holes punched through its sides. She wasn't trying to live like them. She was building something else, something they hadn't understood, and it was working. That winter took 2 babies in town before the first thaw. A man froze inside his barn trying to check on his livestock. One settler burned his own outhouse for heat. Meanwhile, one morning in late January, a woman named Elsie Penor saw something that made her stop mid-step on her way to gather snow. She looked up past the ridge just for a moment and saw it, a curl of smoke, clean and straight, rising from the treetops like a signal. And from the trees, a child's arm waved, little, bare-armed, laughing in a blizzard. That afternoon, 3 men gathered with ropes and gear and treed Etheridge again. This time they made it. But when they returned 2 hours later, wind-bitten and speechless, they didn't say much. Just 3 words spoken by Jeb Halley, who was never known for fanciful talk. She ain't cold. Nobody laughed after that. And now, the thing that had been a joke, a widow's lunacy, a mother's madness, was being whispered about in every cabin, a tree house, shelter built not for fun, but for survival, and somehow it worked. Warmth in the trees while frost killed calves. In the fields, how why? Those were questions that would haunt the valley long into spring. But before any settler would dare climb that ridge again, another storm was coming, and Mary Toiver's treehouse would face the one thing, even he hadn't prepared for, visitors. They arrived in the middle of the 3rd storm. 3 silhouettes in the swirling white, staggering up the ridge trail like drunks who had run out of prayers. Each step they took sank them thigh-deep into powder, and their breath hissed through frost-crusted skers. They were men Mary Toiver recognized, even through the snow hiss and distance. Ezra Hanley, Elsie Skozen, led the trio, followed by a limping sheriff's deputy named Boone and an old carpenter whose name Mary had never learned, but whose laughter she'd once heard through a saloon wall. She didn't climb down to greet them. Instead, she watched from her perch. One child nestled beside her, under the furlined canvas flap, the other still asleep in a cocoon of warmth inside. A treehouse stood firm, built not in one tree, but lashed into 3 massive pines forming a natural triangle with foot-wide planks running the floor. Walls insulated with clay-packed bark and a fire shelf on the far edge vented through a rock-lined chimney she'd sunk halfway down the tree trunk. The men shouted once, something half apology, half plea. They waved their arms, stomped their boots, and pointed to the sky as if asking mercy from her or maybe from the gods that seemed to have abandoned the rest of the valley. Mary watched. She did not wave back. Instead, she opened the flap enough to reach into a hanging pail, dipped a ladle of water, and poured it slowly out the side. Steam rose where it met the cold air. The message was clear. Warmth still lived here. The men didn't leave. Not at. They built a small lean-to at the base of the hill, little more than sticks and canvas, and huddled under it for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, only 2 stood when the flap opened. The 3rd had taken ill, delirious with fever, mumbling nonsense about Mary's late husband coming to fetch him in the night. She fed the remaining 2, lowered them a wrapped bundle of smoked meat and hard tack on a rope, said nothing. The act spoke for itself. They didn't try to climb. No one ever did. Back in town, when the 2 men returned, one carried on a sled. They were changed, not just quieter, but haunted. Ezra Hanley refused to describe what he'd seen. The deputy resigned a week later and moved south, claiming the high winds had voices in them. The carpenter died of pneumonia before he could finish the new schoolhouse roof. But all agreed, something about that treehouse wasn't natural, not in a wicked way, not magic or ghostly, just unexplainable. They said it was warmer than any cellar, quieter than any root cave, and that desno on the trees didn't stick. It melted even when temperatures dropped below 0, as if the shelter bled heat poured. What no one realized was how Mary had done it. Not fully. She hadn't just built up, she had built down 2 below the trees, hidden beneath snow and earth. She dug a hollow 4 deep, ringed with rock and lined with clay-packed wood. There she kept a slow-burning fire feed, carefully with dried pitchwood and coals, carried in from her husband's old hidden cache up in the ridges. The smoke passed through a triple baffle system, rock chambers layered with mud and arbs, cooling and cleaning it before it was piped up through a carved hollow log that vented gently through the rear pine's natural crook. It smoked downhill to snow so it never gave them away. Above the heat rose, not just through air, but through a lattice, Ophiran pots, buried in dirt-packed floorboards, warmed from the fire's convection and filled with stone's thethaled heat. For hours, her children slept between these pots, wrapped in pelts, never touching snow, never hearing wind. It wasn't magic, it was pain turned to calculation. It was survival through obsession. And it had come from a year off, watching her husband freeze. Mary had learned, grief taught her, so did failure, so did hunger. But it wasn't just about staying warm anymore. It had become about not dying where others did. By February, settlers were divided. Some still called her a witch. Others whispered she was a genius. But none could ignore the truth. Her children were healthy, pink-cheeked, seen from afar, laughing in the snow. No frostbite, no cries for help. Which is why when the preacher's wife fell ill, and the medicines spoiled in the freeze, the town's midwife, Martha Glenn, Comito Mary's tree, she didn't sneak or shout. She walked up slow, arms raised, bundled like a bear. She brought no gun, no men, just her cracked hands and chapped face, and the soft trembling of a woman who had lost her sister in childbirth the week before. Mary didn't wave, didn't shout, but she lowered a bundle. It contained juniper bark, honey mixed with pine sap, boiled snow packed in a charred clay jar, and something else. A small twist of dried leaves folded in rabbit hide, with instructions scrolled on a slat of bark. It worked. The preacher's wife lived. That night, Mary saw a light on in the chapel for the first time since December. Candles, glowing again, a hymn hummed under breath. She didn't cry. She just sat beside the fire shelf and ran her fingers over her. The notches in the wood, the ones she'd carved to mark each day, they'd survived since the first snow. There were 52 of them. But now the valley had changed. Pride turned to pleading. Harshness gave way to humility. Men who once mocked her now debated whether her method should be copied, and a few did try. They built tree platforms. None succeeded. One man built too shallow, and the cold leached through. Another tried burning pitch in a pan and smoked himself, unconscious. A third cut into a penny too thick and brought the whole structure down. His wife broke her arm. They crawled back to town under sleet. They had tried to imitate their shape, but not the knowledge. Mary had studied not just warmth, but movement, how heat rose, how wind blew, how sap flowed. She'd watched ants, studied the way owls nested, how snow melted around stones faster than soil. She'd built a shelter that breathed, not trapped, one that adapted. Still they kept trying. And when a traveling merchant arrived from farther west, dragging a sled of spoiled goods and a half-rosin dog, he asked only one question after learning about her. How far can this spread? They didn't know. But the idea had caught, and that terrified some, because in every frontier town, pride was currency. And Mary Toiver had proven something dangerous, that a woman alone, scorned, forgotten, and desperate, could outthink the whole of Berklow Ridge. What came next wasn't praise, it wasn't thanks, it was control. Men gathered at the chapel, debated whether to send for her, to ask her to come teach, not as an equal, as a tool. But they were too late. Mary wasn't coming down. Not for the preacher, not for the sheriff, not for the doctor who'd once told her that her grief made her unsuitable to resi children in winter, and not for the mayor who had refused to send help when her food ran out in October. Instead, she did something else. She sent a map drawn in charcoal on a stretched hide, folded and left at the trailhead in the night. No signature, no messenger. Just a diagram. Part tree, part rock, part hollowed floor, and beside it a single word carved in two. Barkan left atop the hide like a final verdict. Learn. It wasn't a gift, it was a challenge. And for many it was too bitter to swallow. So, the diagram vanished, burned likely, or buried. But one person copied it first, and before long, not in the valley, but up near Birch Hollow. A woman named Della Crane began building something peculiar, a suspended frame between three trees with layers of pine, moss and clay. And when spring thaw, Camion, the mountain trail, opened, folks who passed her site noticed smoke curling through the snow. Just like before, shouldn't speak Mary's name. He didn't have to, because the name had already become a kind of myth. Not a witch, not a prophet, just a woman who had refused to freeze. A mother who had climbed higher than shame and built something that others couldn't tear down. But winter wasn't over yet, and Mary's treehouse hadn't faced its worst test. Gut, was still coming, not from weather, from people. The end of February brought a hush, not peace, not quite, but a tight, sharp silence, like the valley had drawn breath and refused to let it out. The cold had sunk in too deep to have any more. Now it just pressed still and heavy like a hand over the mouth. Ice didn't form overnight. Now it stayed thickening with each passing day, burying axes in sheds, sealing doors shut with white walls. In some cabans that snapped louder than voices. Men grew short-tempered, women stopped singing, but in the high pines that strange defiance still stood with lashed into tree trunks, smoke filtering gently through invisible channels, laughter sometimes rising on windless mornings, like music from a dream. Children's laughter, not ragged with hunger, not dry from sickness, just pure, unyielding life. Mary Toiver's treehouse had become by now more than shelter. It was a rumor with weight, a story with breath, and it began to travel. When Elijah Brandt, the fur trader from the west slope, came through the mountain pass, he hadn't even meant to stop in Berklow Ridge. His sled was half empty, his fingers wrapped in blood-stiff cloth, his dog down to ribs in memory. He only stopped because his shores collapsed, and he saw smoke, treetop smoke, just a curl of it far up the ridge. He thought he was hallucinating, but he wasn't. He was lucky. Mary saw him first. From her upper platform, she'd spotted the movement below, saw the man drop to his knees in the drift, heard the thin, failing yelp of the dying dog. She didn't hesitate. No test, no measure of his worth, just action. That was her rule. She didn't come down for the curious, but she did, on rare occasions, descend for the dying. And so that day she climbed down, roped herself through bracing limbs, lowered with practiced care into the snow. Clara had once called her a spider when she moved that way. Legs braced, arms taut, the ropes creaked, the only sound she got. To the man before death did, Elijah would remember little, only fragments. A woman's face, firm and calm. A child's whisper. Heat, unbelievable heat pressing from all sides. A small fire that never smoked. A warm stone placed against his ribs. A broth unlike any Adi tasted. And then waking not in a bed, but in a canvas-wrapped loft, high above the ground. Wrapped in fur with Adar curled at his feet, and wind whispering through pine needles, not groaning through chinked logs. He didn't stay long. Mary didn't allow it. By the third day, she gave him a bundle of boiled roots, a flask of heated tallow broth, and a thick charcoal scroll on cured bark, a rough sketch of a flawed duct system, the hollow stone trick, and the key to what made it work. Not insulation, but air movement. When Elijah limped back into town, dragging his half-dead sled behind him like an anchor, his voice rasped, but steady, he told what he'd seen. Not everyone believed him, but one person did, and she had questions. Martha Glendemet. She'd delivered half the children in the valley and buried nearly as many. In her youth, she'd walked barefoot across floodplains to reach sick mothers, and once spent a week snowed in inside a wagon, delivering twins. She wasn't moved by gossip, but she believed in results. So one morning, when the last of the honey was gone from her cellar, and her hands had gone blue at the tips from tending the sick too long in the cold, she put on her boots, wrapped her scarf 3 times, and started. Up the ridge, Mary did not turn her away. She didn't speak either, but let Martha sit beneath the tree for 2 hours. Then a rope descended, a wrapped package. Inside arbs, yes, but also a tool, a small curved stone knife, its handle sealed in leather, its blade blackened with resin. Martha knew what it was. A bark shaper used for peeling curls from fresh pine meant to create in channels, conduits. Mary hadn't just insulated her treehouse. She'd shaped the bark around it like living vines. Every wall, every crevice, had breathing space behind it, allowing warm air to rise, circle, press inward. She hadn't sealed heat. She'd channeled it. Martha went home and wrote it down carefully, line by line. And then she made the mistake of telling the preacher, not out of betrayal, out of hope. But the preacher didn't hear revelation. He heard heresy, because the treehouse wasn't supposed to work. It wasn't made by men. It wasn't planned with community. It wasn't blessed. And more than anything, it had succeeded where the rest had failed. In some hearts that ignites humility, in others it stirs wrath. The next morning 2 men approached Mary's ridge, not to beg, but to claim, deputized in the name of emergency, public interest. They shouted up, declared that for the greater good she must descend, share her methods, submit to an inventory of resources used. Mary didn't answer, so they built a fire at the base of her tree. A signal fire, they claimed. But the pile was built thick wet wood piled with pitch-soaked rags. Smoke rose thick and dark. Intentional smoke, not the clean spirals she sent. A smoke that clung, that crept. She acted fast. By the time the men realized their mistake, she had released a series of dampened cloth bundles from her upper platform, packed with snow-dense moss and pressed ash. They struck the fire and snuffed it within seconds. The men shouted, ducked, cursed. She lowered another rope. This time, it carried nothing. A message in itself. You will not burn me out. That night, something happened no one expected. Mary climbed down with her children. She walked slow and calm down Thridge Path. Children bundled against her hips, face tight as ice. She said nothing, did not stop, did not speak. She passed through the town at dusk, and she left, gone. No one saw where she went. For 3 days, the treehouse stood empty. On the 4th day, someone climbed it. Sheriff's son, curious and bold, scaled it with rope and spiky boots. He found it empty, yes, but warm, still warm. No fire, no coals, no bodies, but the warmth it held. Clay-packed stones radiated it. Ducted walls exhaled it. And there, in the center of the floor, carved gently in Tethmain beam, were 4 words scorched with a branding iron. Build or be buried. The boy came down shaken. His father told him never to speak of it again. But word spread. Others climbed. Some copied. One man even tried to live ether. He froze because it wasn't the house that warmed them. It was her knowledge, her adjustments, her discipline. The town searched half-heartedly. No one found tracks. No fires spotted in the ridges. It was Sasson she'd gone west, maybe to join the old road caravans, or vanish into the mountain hollows, where the sky cracked wider than thought, until a child in Birch Hollow said she saw a woman in the trees, not walking, building, and a week later, a hunter swore he saw a platform forming in the high aspens near Frost's Cut, a place so cold it cracked rifle stocks by February. Another treehouse, another curl of smoke. They say Mary is still building, not for pride, not for thanks, but for survival. They say if you're freezing, starving, dying in the snow, and you see smoke curling sideways through the trees, clean smoke, steady smoke, don't chase it. Wait. And if you're lucky, she'll lower a rope. And if you're worthy, she'll let you warm your bones. Not to save you, but to keep the fire alive. Because Mary Toiver no longer builds just for herself. She builds for those who've been forgotten and in the coldest parts of the mountains. Her tree houses now rise like strange beacons, homes not of stone, boot of will, bones lashed to bark, breath caught in wood, warmth where there should be none. The cold is coming again, and this time she's ready. The mountains held their breath. Spring did not come. By mid-March, what should have been slush was still powder. Trees that should have dripped with thaw were instead brittle, black-tipped, cracking gunder, the weight of an unrelenting freeze. It was the kind of cold that rewrote memories, that made men forget color of dirt, made children think warmth was a story told by fools. By now, Mary Toiver was more than myth, Shia's movement. The map she left at the chapel trail had not been burned, as the town believed. It had been copied by Simeon, smart enough not to say so. Delacron, widowed the year before and forced to raise her to young nephew, Sefta her sister perished of lung fever, had pressed that diagram into wax, copied it to cloth, then burned the hide and scattered the ashes before anyone could question her. It wasn't just a survival tactic anymore. It was a system. She called it the hollow lung, a layered construction, 3 trees minimum. But some could work with 2 if lashed properly. Clay-packed ducts beneath the floor, stones warmed in what she called a pit kettle and stored in wrapper of elk hide, heat caught, carried, and held. A design that didn't trap warmth. It trained it, pulled it, stored it, redirected it like breath through a flute. Della's version wasn't perfect. She used spruce instead often, and her elevation was lower, which meant colder updrafts, but it held through 2 storms. It held her nefs didn't cough, and that was enough. Others came to her, not openly, no town meetings, just whispers, quiet knocks after sundown. A woman with burned hands, a man whose wife had frozen in a root cellar beside their infant. They came not for charity, but for instruction. They wanted to build, not imitate, understand. And Della, who hadn't been scorned for wearing her dead husband's coat too long, taught them. She wasn't Mary, but she learned from her. Soon there were 5 tree houses, then 7, all women, not one man among the builders. It wasn't exclusion, it was necessity. The women had no pride to protect, no reputations left intact. They were the forgotten, the widowed, the barren, the left behind. They were willing to climb trees in the snow. The preacher called it unnatural, said manoirs meant to build down, to root into earth, not reach towards sky like beasts in trees. He preached of towers, at Babel, of judgment. Said the snow was God's reminder of humility. The next week his chimney collapsed, and no one helped him rebuild it because by then even the skeptics had noticed. The children in the trees weren't coughing. But then came the first threat. A man named Cyrus Hall, one of the last old trappers, who hadn't yet fled west, had built himself a cabin high on the southern slope, smug in the fact that his meat was smoked, his boots were beaver-lined, and his dog was mean enough to keep beggars at bay. He didn't believe in tree houses until he tried Terab 1. It happened one night, late March. He'd seen the glow from a treehouse built just north of Splitterivine smoke, faint but steady. He waited for the dark, climbed quietly. He didn't expect the false platform. Murray had designed it long ago. A decoy landing just below the true structure made of rotted planks layered in snow. The idea was never to harm, just to warn. But Cyrus slipped. He fell 15 feet and broke his leg in 2 places. He screamed, cursed, begged. No one came down. He lay there until dawn, drifting in and out of pain, fevered, snow-packed, and then, as the sun broke weakly through the fog, something lowered beside him. Not a rope, not a hand, a package wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside boiled roots, 2 coals, sealed in an iron pan, a flat tin of bark paste, and a note scrawled in charcoal. This is your only mercy. Cyrus was found 3 days later, dragging himself back toward town. He'd survived barely, but his pride had not. He said nothing of Mary after that. He didn't need to. The message had spread. The tree houses were not to be stolen, not to be claimed. They were earned or ignored. Still, not Anna, because with every new treehouse, something else grew. Resentment. Men who once ran lumberyards, who built log cabins from cleared timber with their sons, now found themselves outpaced by widows with no tools, only patience and rope. Their froze while women's children played in tree nests, steam rising from their breakfast pans. It wasn't fair, and to some fairness meant fire. The first act was cowardly. Someone lit pitch along the base of one tree near Widow Kroshnew's shelter. She'd only just moved in the week before. No family, a soft-spoken woman, maybe 40, with a permanent limp and a nose crooked from some long-ago break. She never asked for help. He just built slow and alone. Fire didn't reach her platform. Mary had taught her to counterfire. She used snow-packed moss bricks pressed tight along the tree trunks at the base, interwoven with clay ropes that dried hard as stone. The pitch fire fizzled within minutes, but it was a message, so she sent one back. The next morning, the wood bar sinist. No one ever proved you, but most guessed Enoch Prasler, a logger with a loud mouth and 2 dead sons, found a stone on his porch, smooth, flat, dark, a treehouse stone, the kind Mary used to mark fire pits. On its surface, scorched with a resin brand, was a word, coward, nothing more. No one ever touched Widow Cros's tree again. By now, Mary herself had not been seen in nearly a month, but signs of her remained. Bundles appeared at trailheads. Small crates of dried cattell root, squirrel fat, pine needle tea, wrapped in bark, tied with thin tight knots that only those who had built will recognize. No signature, just help. She was watching and building. A girl named Rachel, barely 12, claimed she'd seen her once. Said she was higher than the trees, walking a rope line between 2 platforms like a ghost, in the fog. Said she carried a lantern in her teeth and a bundle across her back, twice her size. No one believed her until they found the platform the next day. 2 trees lashed together, half-built, but clearly hers. No child could have made those joints. No man would have been silent about it. She was still out there, and now spring was lit. March passed, then April. Snow still fell. Ice still snapped branches like gunshots. But the tree house stayed warm. Their smoke curled steady. Their children still played, now with kites made of cloth scraps and bone slat frames designed to ride up drafts along the ridge. A sky world, someone called it. Strange, foreign, safe. The ground people grew bitter, but not all. Some, quiet, determined, began to climb, not to take, but to ask. And Mary began Tonesware again, not in voice, in plans. She sent more diagrams, more tools, bark shapers, duct carvings, clay tempering notes. She shared, without signature. No credit asked, only action demanded. Thurls became known, built high. Never seal the floor tight. Let the fire breathe down and the heat rise slow. Don't hoard, don't lie, don't forget who showed you. They carved these rules into bark boards, posted them at trailheads like commandments. By the end of April, there were over 20 tree houses. The preacher's chimney still hadn't been baled, and then came the woman from the east. She wore a black duster, no horse, no name, just a child, mute, wrapped in grey wool, and a pack with pots that clanged like memory. She didn't knock. She climbed 3 stories shy into one of the lesser tree houses near Elkhorn Bend, built by an older woman who had since passed in her sleep, warmed and full. The stranger left the child inside, left the pack, then climbed down and walked away. No words, just trust. That was the last anyone saw of her. But the child stayed and lived because the treehouse did what no one else could. It kept him warm, and by then, even the most skeptical among Birklaw Ridge had learned the hardest truth of that long, brutal season. The only warm places left were in the trees. By May, the calendar was a lie. Its hold have thawed. The creeks should have run fat and wild, deer pouring through last snow crust for the first blades of green. But nothing green came, only whined, the kind that whistled instead of roared like it had run out, Ephraim settled into warning. Birklaw Ridge had changed. He froze to death 2 feet from a warming pan. His body was found by a 12-year-old boy who'd been gathering twigs for a high fire, a top platform heating test designed to burn low and breathe upward. The boy cried, but he didn't bring the body back. He did what Mary would have done. Built Aiken-stacked stone over chest and face. Let the mountain keep him. There was no room for foolishness anymore. Then Kamiti, blizzard, late May, just when the ice seemed to retreat. No warning, no slow creep, just a sudden shuttering off sky like a door slammed in a child's face. Thunder without rain. Snow so dense it swallowed sound. The storm killed 13 head of cattle. 2 barns collapsed. A supply wagon headed for the low pass flipped into a ravine. One Boydie Sapard in the white, walking 10 feet to his family's outhouse, and a treehouse fell. Number 12. Built too narrow to shallow-rooted. Its supports lashed to spruce instead of pine. Built low to avoid wind. The children inside served because someone had already evacuated them. When neighbors climbed to search the wreckage, they found signs that the 2 children had been moved the day before. Bundles gone, bedding cleared, footprints high in the snow leading to a ridge further west. No one had seen Mary, but they all knew. The survivors were found in a newer treehouse, one that hadn't existed the week before. Larger, reinforced, higher, built by someone who understood the wind. The rumors became certainty. Mary Toiver wasn't gone. She wasn't hiding. She was watching, moving from one ridge to the next, not alone. Maybe, some whispered, she had a helper now. A boy, with a twisted foot who carried rope faster than any adult, and could shimmy up trees like a raccoon. Others said shooked alone. No fire, no pack, just a lantern, and a face so calm it quieted crying babies. Truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the warmth held. Spring finally came, slow and suspicious. Ice receded like a wounded animal, biting as it went. Even into June, some mornings bore frost sharp enough to split buckets, but the trees turned. Eventually, buds came. Water flowed, and in the valleys, children stepped from rope ladders and touched earth like pilgrims. The first crops planted were not in fields. They were in baskets, raised like the houses, safe from late freezes. They called them sky gardens. The preacher, who had seconded the women, now held service beneath a treehouse, said his sermons rang truer under pines. Fewer echoes, more soul. No one laughed because laughter had changed. The cruel kind, the mocking, sneering kind, had been buried in snowdrifts alongside arrogance. What remained was the laughter of children in high platforms, the murmur of rope tightening over bark, the soft joy of breath, visible not from cold, but from warmth, meeting air. That summer, something strange happened. Mary returned. She didn't announce herself, but one morning at the chapel trailhead, a bundle appeared. Inside it, the original bark map, faded but intact, now copied on oilskin and packed with a small jar of pitch paste and a single iron nail. Blackened but unused. Attached, a note, not long, just for words. Teach them this time. No name, didn't need one. They framed it, hung it in the new town hall, built not of logs, but of layered platforms. 3 stories tall with vented floors and central fire chutes, a hybrid, part house, part tree. Children climbed it every morning to learn. Cliff Mary's legacy was never in her silence, it was in what she left behind. The system, the shape, the warmth. She had taken grief and twisted it into rope. She'd taken isolation and nailed it into beams. She'd taken the mockery of men and turned it into a door, one rung at a time, until she had risen above every voice that once called her foolish. She didn't wait for escalator. She built it high, wide, strong, and it worked. Not because it was magical, but because it was hers. She listened to wind, studied ice, trusted herself, and in doing so, created a way of life that saved not just her children, but an entire valley. They used to laugh, now they build, and every time a new rope ladder is tied, or a vented floor packed with heated stone, or a mother teaches her child to read by pine fire glow above the forest floor, Mary Toiver lives again. Not in stories, not in statues, but in the quiet, climbing defiance of a woman who was told to stay down and rose anyway.